In this video, I'm going to show you how to lay out your patterns on muslin, make sure they're on grain, and then how to cut them out and how to mark all the important information on our muslin from our patterns. So all the kind of body balance lines, so hip line, center front, bust line, things like that. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. We're going to start with the skirt portion. First thing you want to do is lay out your muslin. Okay, in this case we're making the basic dress out of muslin. And the first thing you want to do is make sure that your salvages are lined up. Okay, the torn edges, we don't worry about the torn edges. We just want to worry about the salvages. Okay, so what I usually do to make sure everything's on grain is just kind of flip up the fabric first and bring salvage to salvage, like so. Okay, make sure that's all very smooth, and then make sure your salvages are lined up. And again, whatever happens here, we don't care about. It's more about what's happening here on the salvage. Okay, so I think that's pretty good. All right, so I'm going to turn this around because I have a pattern piece that's cut on fold. I want to get the fold close to me. And I'm just going to smooth that out. Now remember, whether you're cutting in muslin or a different fabric, whenever you fold fabric over like this, what's inside is considered the right side of the fabric. That's the side of the fabric that everybody would see. It would be on the outside of the garment. And then what's on the outside here, this is considered the wrong side of the fabric. Okay, so that's what would be in against the body. All right, so let's go ahead and start by laying our patterns on. I'm going to start by laying out my center front. Here's my center front piece. Okay, this is the front skirt. The front of it is cut on fold, so here's my fold. I'm going to go ahead and place the cut edge of my pattern right on that fold, like so. That looks good. And let's go ahead and start pinning. So don't lift your fabric or pattern off the table when you pin. What you want to do is just push the pin in, and then where it's coming up, you're going to put your finger and kind of pull up a little bit, and then push the rest of the way through, like so. Okay, and I'm going to go ahead and smooth out. I didn't need to measure off my salvage or anything to make sure that my pattern is on grain, because I know my fabric is on grain already, so that means this fold is on grain. So just placing this center front right against the fold automatically puts this pattern on grain. All right. When I'm pinning this on, I'm going to pin just about every 3 to 4 inches. We don't need to put a lot of pins in it. If you put too many pins in, you start easing your fabric to your pattern. You don't want that. Okay, so there's our first one pinned on. Let's go ahead and do our back. I'm going to flip this around towards me. Okay, in this case, I will need to measure off my salvage to make sure this pattern piece is on grain. So I'm going to grab a ruler. All right, because this is a longer pattern piece, I'm going to measure it off the salvage at the top of it and at the bottom to make sure it's perfectly on grain. I'm going to put a number on my salvage, doesn't matter which one. In this case, I'm using 6, and then I'll put 8 3/4 on my grain line, so that's perfectly on grain here. We'll use the same numbers down here, so again 6 on salvage, and then I did 8 3/4 on my grain. It just barely fits on here. There we go. So this pattern piece is now on grain. This is the back skirt. I'm going to go ahead and pin this on as well. And I like to just smooth across as I pin my pattern piece. Make sure it's not getting any folds or bends in it, and that the pattern or that the fabric is also nice and smooth underneath. There we go, all pinned on. Alright, so now we're going to cut this out. Again, I don't want to lift this up as I cut. I want to keep it flat on the table. My scissors will also be flat on the table, and as I cut, I will just move them across the table and open and close them. Okay? If you're right-handed, you want whatever you're cutting to the left of your scissors. If you're left-handed, you want whatever you're cutting to the right of the scissors. That way you can see exactly where the pattern edge is and where you're cutting. If I were to cut here, I wouldn't be able, my scissors would block my pattern edge. Okay, so since I'm right-handed, I want to keep everything to the left of my scissors. Alright, so let's go ahead and cut this out. And I can, makes it easier, go ahead and move whatever you're cutting in a better position so you can cut it easier. Try not to let the scissors get too far away from you. The sooner you can separate the patterns, it makes it easier to cut. There we go. Okay, once you've fully cut out a pattern, make sure you notch wherever the stitching lines touch the cut edge. And any other important information on there might need to be notched. In this case, we'll do the hip line and then all our dart information. Okay, so like where our dart legs and our center fold lines of our darts touch the cut edge, we'll notch all that as well. Okay, so let's go ahead and do that. Okay, that piece is all notched. Let's put it aside for a minute. And we'll cut out our front. This is cut on fold again, so once this is cut out and we open it up, we'll have a full front piece. The back was not cut on fold, so once we unpin that, we'll have a left and right, two pattern pieces, one left side and one right side. Okay, this is all cut out. Let's go ahead and notch it. Again, we're going to notch all our dart information where it touches the cut edge, so dart legs and center fold line of darts. And then wherever our stitching lines come to the cut edge, we're going to do our hip line at side seam. Okay. Alright, two other notches. First of all, we don't want to notch anything on the fold, because if we're to clip in, say for our hip line or our seam allowance, we would end up with a hole in our pattern, okay, or in our fabric. But what we are going to notch here, okay, right here, we want to notch right on the fold, okay, vertically, right at center front, okay, at the waistline, and we'll do the same thing here at the hip, or at the hem. Okay, two very important notches. Whenever you have anything on center front and there's no seam there, same thing if it was at center back and there was no seam, we always want to notch the top and bottom of it. All right. Okay, so now that we've cut out our two skirt pieces, we need to mark some information on there. All right. Because this is a muslin, it's basically our draft. We want to make sure that it's fitting our client or our dress form or fit model, whatever, correctly. Okay, to be able to do that, we need to transfer some important information onto the muslin. Okay, in this case, we need to transfer our hip lines. Okay, and then also our center front line. A few other things we need to transfer are our dart tips. Okay, so we know where the end of the dart is. Because this is a symmetrical garment, meaning it's the same on both sides, we only need to transfer those hip lines to one side of the garment. Okay, so here we go. Let's start. This is our front. Let's start with that. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to transfer my dart information. So I'm just going to put a pin right through each of the dart tips, like so. You can see it's coming out of the back right there. Same thing here. Put a pin through. And I'm going to unpin this a little bit. Remember, our darts, or the seam allowance of our darts, will be on the wrong side of our fabric. So I'm going to mark that on the wrong side of the fabric. Remember that what's inside, the two sides that are touching right now, that's the right side. Okay, so this side and this side is the wrong side. So that's what we're going to mark. So I'm just marking right on the fabric, right where my pins are going through. That side and then the other side as well. Okay, so there we go. I've marked my dart tips. You can see them right there and right there, and right there and right there. Okay, I can unpin this pattern. Now, before you start sewing, or until you start sewing, you always want to keep your patterns with the pieces of fabric they cut out from. Okay, right now I'm going to mark this balance line on here, but once I'm done doing that, I'm going to put this pattern back onto that fabric. Right, so I'm going to open this up. This is my right side now, and this is the side I want those balance lines on so I can see them when they're on the form. Okay, and I need to mark my center front line, and I need to mark my hip line. This is pretty easy because both of these lines are straight, and I have notches that I can line up. So let's start with our center front. Okay, so I have a notch at center front at the hem, right there, and I have a notch at center front at the waist, right here. Okay, so I can go ahead and line those two notches up with my ruler, and just connect them with a straight line. There we go. Okay, I also have my hip line I need to mark. Remember, I only need to mark this on one side. I have a notch right here. That's my hip line, and I have a notch right here. Let me just flip this around so I can access it a little easier. All right, so again, I can line those two notches up, and I'm only going to mark it on one side. So I'll line up those two hip line notches, and I'll just draw a line until I touch my center front. And I'll stop right there. There we go. Okay, so now I've marked my center front and my hip line. Okay, now I want to mark my back pattern. Let's put this aside for just a second. We're going to get it out again in just a minute. All right, let's start by marking the notches, our dart tips on our back skirt pattern pieces. So we'll put pins right through the tip of our darts. And I'm just going to unpin this so I can access those pins. Fold this back. Okay, again, this is the wrong side of my fabric, so I'll just mark dart tips there. If this is fashion fabric, you'd want to use chalk or a tailor's tack. Unless it was like a dark fabric or something. I've used pencil before that I knew wasn't going to show through. Okay, alright, so I've marked my dart tips. Now I need to mark a hip line on one of these. Alright, we don't need to mark the center back because we have a seam there. Okay, so again, our body balance lines on the body, if you think it is bust line, on the female form is the bust line, the waistline, the hip line. Okay, and then you have center front and center back. If you have a seam in any of those places, you don't need to mark it. So in this case, we have a seam at true waist right here, so we don't need to mark that. Okay, so center back, we also have a seam. We won't need to mark that. I mean, we eventually will mark it with stay stitching so we know where to close this at, but we don't need to mark that right now. Okay, so let's get our front out again. Here's the front. I've marked my hip line on this side. I want to make sure I mark the hip line on the back panel that's going to end up sewing to this side here. Okay, so I know that my right sides are on the inside. That's my right side, so that's the right side, and that's the right side. Okay, I'm going to take the side that's going to sew to this, which is this side. This side will end up sewing here. Here's my side seam for my back, side seam for the front, and we put right sides together. Okay, so this is, we would stitch here. So this is the side that will stitch to this. Okay, so I want to mark the hip line on this. I have 2 notches at my hip. It's a straight line, right here and right here. I'm going to go ahead and connect those 2 notches. And mark them. Okay, so now I've marked the hip line on the back panel that will connect to this hip line. Okay, so there's my hip line. All right, so let's go ahead and put right sides back together for now. Again, until we're ready to sew these, now that we've prepped them, we don't want to handle them too much because we don't want things to start fraying on us. So we're going to fold them back up for now. And so we don't lose track of our patterns or our pieces that we cut out, we'll just put it back, our pattern back on it, and then throw a couple pins in like so to keep them together. Put that aside. And then same thing with our back. Line all our pieces back up. And just put it back together. There we go. So now we've cut out our front and back skirt pieces. Okay? All right, so let's go ahead and move on to the bodice.